So I mentioned before about Dr. John Hunter. He was running a medical school, a school for surgery. And so if you're a professional family and you want your young son to become a surgeon, you have to send him to a surgery school. And to do that, they needed bodies, and they needed fresh bodies, and they needed fresh human bodies. And of course, there's a limit to the number of those that are in hospitals or morgues at the time, and they tend to go off and rot pretty quickly. So there was a huge demand for fresh cadavers, corpses, and this meant that there was a roaring trade in grave robbing. They're not trying to rob valuables buried with any bodies, but rob the bodies themselves to supply the medical establishments with fresh corpses to do their experiments on. There was this great need for it, and what you had then was this high class mixed with the underclass. They both sort of provided for each other, and they both needed each other. The high class gave them the money, and the grave robbers, the body snatchers, the resurrection men as they were called, fed them the bodies. There was reports of fights at the scenes of hangings, of public executions. The family of the executed criminals trying to snatch their brother, their cousin's body away before people moved in to try and buy it for a few shillings and then sell it on for more. So there was a massive trade in this, but it brings together the high class and the low class, and it brings together the respectable with the shady and the suspect. So again, that theme of duality, that mix and that sort of criminality bubbling under the surface is there in the whole of Jekyll and Hyde. And we can take this even further in the case of Burke and Hare, who were two Scottish gentlemen, again outwardly respectable, but inwardly very dark and very twisted. They ran a hotel, and they realized that they weren't making enough money, and so at some point they've decided, okay, we're going to murder our guests in the middle of the night and then sell their bodies in the morning. I can't imagine they got many guests for very long, but they were found out fairly soon. But again, there you have that need for bodies in the background, and that superficiality and duality. Right, so on to some deliberate confusion, by which I mean deliberate confusion, of course. How does Stevenson deliver the story? Have a think about this. I've said already it's a whodunit, and it's deliberately misleading. He's trying to confuse you as a reader. And the first time I taught this book, I thought I made the wrong choice in choosing this book because it's too confusing. All the men sound the same, and it's written in this weird Victorian endless sentences, and I don't know who's speaking, and at some point you think this is the narrator, and then it changes to that, and he's doing that on purpose, right? Like any film who's a crime film, a whodunit, they don't want you to know right from the start. They want to play with you and mess around with you and give you a few false leads and red herrings. So you've got to have that patience at the start to go with that. You've got initially some dream sequences. It's not certain if what we're reading is reality or not, because it's the dreams of Utterson, and then you have these narrators. You have the story of Mr. Enfield starts telling his story. You've got Utterson as a narrator. Chapter 4, we're not even sure who the narrator is. It's a random kind of a voice that doesn't seem to be any of the characters. At the end, you've got Dr. Lanyon's narrative, and you've got Dr. Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case. So you've got all of like 5 different narrators in about 10 chapters, and they're all men of a certain age. They all kind of appear very interchangeable. They all have their secrets, and they're all very, very similar. This is not an accident, right? He's trying to confuse you and trying to leave you uncertain, because of course the first time you come to that text, you don't know that Hyde is Jekyll and Jekyll is Hyde. Most readers know that before arriving at the text in these days, but initially, of course, they didn't. So going from left to right there in terms of those pictures, you have Dr. Jekyll, then Mr. Enfield, then Poole, then Mr. Utterson, then Mr. Hyde, then Dr. Lanyon, and then Mr. Guest, the clerk. So again, they're all men of a certain age, these principal characters. So one genius element of Jekyll and Hyde is that it's a text about split personality, that itself is split personality. You know, in terms of its structure, it's made up of these different voices and these different perspectives. Throughout the description in the setting, you have this fog and this darkness that swirls around in these London streets, and that adds to the confusion. Again, he's perhaps borrowing things there from Shakespeare, perhaps in Macbeth, you know, with the fog and the filthy air and that sense of questions and confusion and insecurity and lack of certainty that Shakespeare uses to set the scene in Macbeth. Similar things going on here in Jekyll and Hyde. But even the setting is confusing. It's not quite clear. It's supposedly London, but it also seems like it could be Edinburgh. So it's perhaps not clear if it's England or Scotland. And in one sense, it could well be Edinburgh in terms of Stevenson's influences. This is where he grows up, and he lives up in the newer town side of it, but goes down into the old town. So Edinburgh is this quite divided city where as it developed and as it was built out, like many cities, newer, bigger houses were built up on the hills and up higher up, away from the disease and the dirt and the squalor. But of course, down in the old town is where all the life is, really, the bars and the pubs and the inns and the brothels. So Stevenson himself was known to descend into the old town frequently, and he would frequent these places of ill repute, these inns and these brothels, and then as a gentleman would go back up to the up to the new town, to his life of respectability. So even in the setting there, you've got that sense of a split personality to the city. Now, the whole of Jekyll and Hyde can be seen as a metaphor for sin, okay, for doing things that you shouldn't do, that the Victorian establishment would look down on you for doing. And there's some deleted lines from the start of Jekyll and Hyde that says, "From an early age I became in secret a slave of certain appetites." That was taken out by Stevenson after first giving the script of the novel to his wife. She was so scandalized by it, and she was so disgusted by it, and thought this perhaps people would read this as autobiographical, and even if they didn't, the very subject matter would shame the family and scandalize the family. She requested he rewrite large parts of it, so it was perhaps one of those parts that was taken out there. But maybe the whole thing, the whole notion of having a Hyde side, is a metaphor for drug addiction or alcohol addiction of some sort. There seems to be lots of evidence to sort of back this up, that when he is Hyde, he seems almost like he's on a trip, or that he's intoxicated in some way, that he's full of confidence, he's full of life, he does things that he wouldn't be bold enough to do normally. He is enjoying it, he's getting a thrill out of it, and then the next day he has this sort of hangover state of regret and promises never to go back to the drink, drugs, or to the Mr. Hyde side again. And of course he takes the concoction of drugs to turn him into Mr. Hyde. So at one point when he tries to sort of kick the habit, Jekyll sort of comes back to himself and his normal self again, and starts going out and seeing people in public. And there's this sense of, there's almost a metaphor for someone, a recovering addict perhaps. There's also this notion that Jekyll sort of thinks it's something he can control, but actually he can't control it, like a tragic drug addict or alcoholic that thinks this is something within their power to just do just enough and stay normal, whatever that is, but he can't do. Stevenson himself was suffering medically from a lung disease, and was taking this drug called an ergotine, which helped with his breathing. His lungs were filling up with blood sometimes. He was coughing up his own blood, and this ergotine was one of the only things that helped him, but in itself was mind-altering, was a hallucinogen. So this was giving him some very crazy, psychedelic, unworldly thoughts, at the same time as doing him good. So he sort of knew it had this bad effect on him. At the same time, he knew it was saving his life. So again, the idea of Jekyll coming up with this drug that would do something like that is not entirely far-fetched. This is not the realms of complete science fiction. So few would know, as well as Stevenson himself, the effects of some super powerful drug like this. Again, to summarize, the sin in question perhaps here is a drink or drugs. the Victorian establishment wouldn't want men to be doing that, and certainly not doing that to excess. However, there was hundreds of pubs, there were hundreds of bars and inns, and there were also hundreds of brothels and hundreds of opium dens in Victorian London, and they don't exist without a certain amount of custom and clientele and money is the reality. So in many senses, Jekyll's description of his time as Hyde reads a bit like an out-of-body experience, this kind of exhilarating high that makes life worth living, and then followed by this come down, and then an individual ravaged by self-loathing and shame. Okay, another possible metaphor, sex. Is the whole thing a metaphor for sex? Hyde indulging in Jekyll's sexual desires, his human biological desires. And what kind of sex? Perhaps homosexual sex. So is there this hint that prostitution is the sin? When Enfield's coming back in the middle of the night, when he sees the door in the first place, where's he coming from? Where's he been? He's been out all night and we're not really told where he's been. And again, Stevenson was known to frequent brothels and prostitutions and so on, going into the old town of Edinburgh. So perhaps it's sex. They wouldn't be allowed to have casual sex and not outside of wedlock. By society and certainly by high society, and certainly if they wanted to retain their reputation as a gentleman. But the reality is that hundreds of thousands of them kept the prostitutes of London in business, and in this text here, there is the possibility that the sex in question is homosexual sex. The whole of Jekyll and Hyde, many theorists have argued that it's a metaphor for homosexuality. The characters are all male. Okay, they're all of a certain age, a similar age. There is no hint of a girlfriend anywhere, or of a wife, or even a mistress, an ex, a bit on the side. And when I mentioned this to a colleague of mine, she said, "Oh, well, Victorian novels are always like that. Women always get left out." And she's not wrong, but this feels deliberate. This feels like almost completely outside of the text. There's only the maid at the window. That's pretty much the only female character at all, and even her role is so brief. All these men seem to share this secrecy that could incriminate them all. They all speak of each other with this bond of brotherhood and this unshakable trust and bond that they have with each other. And what's also in the mix here is that homosexuality had been criminalized. Okay, all homosexual acts between men was an imprisonable offence. And in 1885, you see, just a year before Jekyll and Hyde was published, gross indecency was made a criminal activity. And indeed, one of the first things that Mr. Utterson worries about when thinking what's happened to Jekyll, thinks he's being blackmailed. What has he got to do with this grubby Hyde character? Well, maybe he's got something on him. Maybe it's a blackmailing thing. And there's just this hint that people were blackmailing each other due to perhaps secrets or their private lives. Again, a suggestion that the murder of Danvers Carew in chapter 4 is perhaps a pickup gone wrong, what was known as a pretty greeting. Where it would be illegal to be gay or to indulge in homosexuality. And so often homosexual relationships had to be kept in the shadows, in the dark, in secret. And there's this suggestion that Danvers Carew is perhaps on the prowl for a younger man, or for a lover, for a gay lover, perhaps. At the time, you have this very public scandal called the Cleveland Street Scandal, where a male brothel was busted and was sort of exposed. And so this throws out so many things that are relevant to Jekyll and Hyde. One, this sort of superficiality, this idea on the surface he's a gentleman, but actually they're indulging in these sins that are criminal, according to the Victorian establishment mind. And you had very high class, very, very rich, wealthy men visiting this brothel and engaging in sex with much younger men and much poorer men. So there was this sense of the upper classes exploiting the lower classes, the rich exploiting the poor, and sort of corrupting them. And this went very high up. There was even allegations this involved high level members of the royal family. Prince Albert Victor, who was second in line to the throne, was allegedly there. His best friends and his known associates were there and were busted, although he seemed to have been absent that night when his whole circle, his social circle, was there. So this scandal was very, very public, and again rocks the Victorian establishment and how they are perceive themselves and the stories they tell themselves about their superiority.